What if I told you that Mercedes won in Australia thanks to something that no one had seen in their car? Not even inside the paddock itself at the start of the weekend. Because after the Melbourne Grand Prix something happened that set off all the alarms in Formula One. The telemetry data of George Russell's Mercedes showed a completely different behavior on the straights, an electric thrust that lasted longer than in Ferrari and Red Bull and that no one could fully explain. The most shocking thing came when Nico Rosberg analyzed that data and realized that the W17 hit a technical advantage that could change the beginning of this new era of Formula One. And when they began to review the speed curves, what they found left the paddock completely surprised. The Australian Grand Prix is usually the place where the first truths of the season begin to be revealed. After months of speculation, pre-season tests full of unknowns and teams hiding their true potential, Melbourne becomes the first scene where the masks begin to fall. And this year was no different. However, what happened with Mercedes was something that very few expected. While the majority of the paddock was focused on the battle between McLaren, Ferrari, and Red Bull, George Russell's Mercedes began to show behavior that did not fit with what was believed to be known about the team's real performance. Little by little, quietly, something inside the W17 was catching the attention of rival engineers. Over the weekend, Russell built an increasingly solid performance. His car looked especially competitive on the long straights of Albert Park, a circuit that always reveals a lot about the energy and aerodynamic efficiency of cars. At first glance, many thought it was simply a good setup or a balanced car for the Australian track conditions. But when the behavior of the Mercedes and speed and acceleration data began to be analyzed in more detail, some specialists began to notice something strange. Not only did the car accelerate well at the start of the straights, something any hybrid system can achieve using the initial thrust of the MGUK, but it also maintained that momentum longer than its rivals. That detail may seem small, but in modern Formula One it is huge. Hybrid systems have very clear limits on how much energy they can deploy and for how long they can do so in each revolution. For this reason, all cars normally show a fairly similar pattern in the speed graphs. Strong acceleration at the beginning of the straight and a progressive drop in the slope when the electrical system begins to limit its contribution. The curious thing about Russell's Mercedes is that pattern seemed to be broken. In the comparison graphs, their speed continued to increase with a more constant gradient right at the point where Ferrari and Red Bull were beginning to stabilize. It was then when several technical analysts began to review the onboard images and speed traps of the circuit. The conclusion was increasingly clear. The Mercedes seemed to maintain an abnormally long electric thrust phase compared to the rest of the grid. It wasn't just a fast car in a straight line, it was something more sophisticated. The deployment of the hybrid system was working extremely efficiently, allowing the car to continue pushing when the others had already reached their energy limits. Meanwhile, outside the garages, the data continued to circulate among analysts, journalists, and former drivers who now work as commentators. And it was precisely one of them, someone who knows very well how the secrets within Mercedes work, who when reviewing those graphs was completely shocked. Because when Nico Rosberg began to look in detail at the telemetry of Russell's car, he found something that made him stop immediately. Something that, according to him, explained why the Mercedes behaved so differently on the Australian straights. When a Grand Prix ends, another type of race begins that almost no one sees. It does not happen on the track, nor in front of the cameras, but in the engineers' computers, in the telemetry analyses, and in the comparisons that the teams carry out to understand what really happened during the race. And it was precisely at that moment, when the data from the Australian Grand Prix began to be calmly studied, when something appeared that caught our attention. The speed graphs of George Russell's Mercedes showed a different pattern to its rivals. Something about that car was working in a way that Ferrari, Red Bull, and the rest of the teams simply weren't replicating. The important thing here is that it is not an illegal device or a hidden trick outside the regulations. Everything points to an extremely refined combination between combustion chamber design, engine efficiency, and hybrid system calibration. In modern Formula One, these differences may seem small on paper, but on the track they translate into tenths of a second per lap. And when those tenths appear in every straight line, the result can be a competitive advantage that is very difficult for rivals to match. As more specialists reviewed the data, the picture began to become clearer. Mercedes hadn't hidden a magic button or a secret part inside the car. What he had done was something much more complex. Optimize his power unit architecture and energy management to the point of extracting more performance from the same regulations that all teams use. And when a team achieves that at the beginning of a new technical era, the consequences can be enormous for the rest of the season. That is why the reactions within the paddock began to intensify. Rival engineers knew that this type of advantage is not always easy to copy quickly. It's not just about adjusting a spoiler or modifying an aerodynamic setup. Whether the secret is in the engine architecture or the way the hybrid system manages energy, replicating it can take months of development. And in the meantime, Mercedes could take advantage of that performance window to accumulate important points in the first races of the championship. And that's where the story takes another interesting turn. Because while the paddock was trying to figure out what was really happening with Russell's car, even more disturbing rumors began to emerge. Some teams were already pushing for a review of the regulations related to that type of engine operation. And if those rumors were true, Mercedes' supposed secret could have its days numbered, but not immediately. Because if the FIA decided to intervene, the team would most likely still have several races to take advantage of that advantage before any regulatory changes came into effect. When a technical innovation appears in Formula One, the paddock's reaction usually always follows the same pattern. First comes the surprise, then the analysis, and finally the political pressure. And that was exactly what started to happen after the Australian Grand Prix. As rival engineers reviewed every telemetry graph and every speed recorded on the Albert Park straights, it was beginning to become clear that the Mercedes behavior was no coincidence. There was something about that car that was allowing George Russell to maintain more constant thrust on the straights, something that was not seen in Ferrari or Red Bull or the rest of the grid. And when one team discovers an advantage like that at the dawn of a new technical era, everyone else begins to wonder how long they can keep it. Conversations within the paddock began to escalate rapidly. Some engineers pointed directly to Mercedes' internal engine design. Others spoke of an extremely advanced calibration of the hybrid system. But everyone agreed on one thing. The Mercedes seemed to have found a more efficient way to convert energy into performance on the track. Technical analyses suggested that this advantage could be related to greater engine combustion efficiency and more intelligent energy management, which would allow electrical energy to be released for longer on the straights. It was not an illegal component or a hidden system outside the regulations, but rather a very advanced interpretation of the current rules. And this is where the story enters an even more delicate area. Because according to several technical reports, some engine manufacturers within Formula One have already asked the FIA to review certain areas of the regulations related to the operation of the power units. The reason is simple. If Mercedes has really found a way to operate with greater energy efficiency within the regulation, that advantage could be very difficult to match quickly. And in such a competitive championship, allowing a team to maintain a technical advantage for too long can completely upset the balance of forces in the first races of the season. However, even if the FIA decides to intervene, regulatory changes usually do not apply immediately. In many cases, when a technical interpretation is detected that generates debate between the teams, the federation can modify the rules, but granting a transition period before the new regulations come into force. And that is precisely what some technical analysis has begun to suggest. That Mercedes could have a window of several races in which its solution remains completely legal before any regulatory change is limited. If this is confirmed, the implications would be enormous. It would mean that Mercedes has not only found a technical advantage at the start of this new stage of Formula One, but could also take advantage of it during a crucial part of the start of the championship. In that scenario, each race would become an opportunity to rack up points as rivals try to understand exactly what the Brackley team is doing differently. And in a long championship, building an advantage in the first few races can set the entire dynamic for the rest of the season. What happened after the Australian Grand Prix made it clear that, in modern Formula One, victories are never explained solely by what we see on the track. Behind each result there is an enormous technical battle that is fought in the engines, in the hybrid system software, and in the way in which each team interprets the regulations. And in this case, everything indicates that Mercedes could have found one of those interpretations that make the difference. This is not an illegal trick or a secret part hidden in the car, but something much more interesting and at the same time much more dangerous for its rivals. An engine architecture and energy management so optimized that they allow the car to maintain electric thrust for longer on the straights, something that was reflected in the telemetry analyses after the Melbourne race. The reaction from the paddock shows how much this advantage has surprised everyone. Rival engineers analyzing data, experts comparing speed curves, and figures like Nico Rosberg observing in detail a behavior that does not coincide with that of other cars. When something like this happens in Formula One, it usually means one thing. Someone has found a small window within the regulations that the rest have not yet known how to exploit. And in a championship where the differences between teams are measured in thousandths of a second, that small window can turn into a huge advantage over several races. Furthermore, the moment in which this innovation appears is key. We are at the beginning of a new technical stage within Formula One, where teams are still learning to make the most of their new engine concepts and hybrid systems. Finding an efficient solution at this early stage can mean getting several steps ahead of the rest of the championship. That's why some teams are already pushing to revise certain areas of the rules, trying to limit a lead that could prove too difficult to match in the short term. But even if changes come to the regulations, there is something that Mercedes has already achieved, demonstrating that they have once again found a very competitive technical direction. After several seasons trying to regain its dominance, the team seems to have found a solution that not only improves the car's performance, but also puts George Russell in a very interesting position for the first races of the championship. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.